This is The Bells of Blood, written by Beryl Coops.
Dawn came to Florence like a breath held too long. A thin silver washed the rooftops, and the city's great bells, Duomo, San Lorenzo, Santa Maria Novella, waited in their towers like giants with closed eyes. Matteo crossed the still damp piazza carrying a parcel of rosemary and hyssop for Maestro Bernardi, the scent sharp in the cool air. Bakers were already hauling warm loaves to window ledges. A cartwheel creaked. Somewhere a cat yowled at a shutter that wouldn't open. It was the hour when Florence looked almost innocent. San Lorenzo's sacristan, old Vanni, with his crooked shoulders, was unbolting the side door when Matteo arrived. "You're early," Vanni grunted, eyeing the parcel. "Bernardi keeps the hours of saints and sinners both." "Today I'm the saint," Matteo said, smiling. "Back before the mortar is warm." Vanni's mouth twitched. "If you're so saintly, carry your feet up the belfry. The rope's been sticking, and my knees have thoughts about ladders." Matteo didn't mind the climb. The stair spiraled in cool shadow, the stone steps worn into shallow bowls by centuries of feet. Dust motes floated in slanting light from the slit windows. From above came the soft, leathery whisper of pigeons. He emerged into the bell chamber and felt the space like a pressure in his ears. The great bronze hung in its cradle, skin dark with age. Its clapper, a blackened iron tongue, rested motionless as if listening to him. Something pale fluttered against it. Matteo frowned and stepped closer. A strip of parchment, thin as an onion skin, had been tied around the clapper with red thread. The knot was tight, the ends trimmed neat. Whoever did this had hands that liked precision. "Vanni?" Matteo called, but the old man's steps were still far below. He eased the parchment free. It was covered in small exact symbols, triangles and crescents and tiny dots, arranged in lines that resembled writing and yet refused to read. Along the edge ran a series of numbers, 6, 11, 4, 11, 2. Matteo's skin prickled. He had seen men hide messages in the margins of ledgers and in the spacing of lines. Venice had taught him the look of a mind that trusted patterns more than people. But this was new, pure form, no words, the language of bells and time. At the bottom, in cramped Tuscan, there was a single sentence. "When the 6th hour's shadow strikes the fishmonger's awning, a blade will answer the bell." Matteo's mouth went dry. The 6th hour's shadow. In morning light, that would fall before the bell of Terst near mid-morning when the market swelled and coins clinked like hail. He looked again at the numbers. 6, 11, 4, 11, 2. He traced them with a finger, as if the parchment might whisper. The symbols grouped themselves in his head. 6, 11, the 6th bell, the 11th stroke, or towers. San Lorenzo's bell, the 11th stair from the landing. No, too private a key. The author wanted the message found, not buried. "Boy," Vanni's voice floated up the stair. "You fallen asleep in the rafters?" "Coming," Matteo called back, slipping the strip into his sleeve. He wasn't sure why he did it. Instinct, perhaps, the same instinct that had sent him running through the plague 4 months ago. He had learned, since then, that truth often arrived with a knife. He met Vanni on the landing, handed over the rope and made some excuse about a loose nail. Vanni harumphed and promised to fix it, then shooed him down the stair with the impatience of an old man whose knees had indeed decided against ladders. Back on the street, the city had quickened. Stalls were opening, apples thumping into baskets, fish laid on shaved ice that smoked faintly in the cool. The fishmonger's awning, striped blue and white, flapped above a table where silver bellies shone like coins. The sentence ticked in Matteo's head, "When the 6th hour's shadow strikes the fishmonger's awning." He looked up. The sun had cleared the eastern roofs and was climbing, the shadows still long but drawing back inch by inch. He paced out the lines with his eyes, imagining the invisible geometry that would deliver some blade to some man at precisely the moment the shadow's edge kissed the canvas. He didn't wait. He went to the fishmonger. "Morning, Neri," Matteo said, planting his parcel on the table. "Bernardi wants bones for broth, the small ones." Neri squinted. "You doctors with your soups. Always bones, never the good parts." "Bones and patience," Matteo said, forcing a grin. "I'll take what you'd throw away." "Then you'll take plenty," Neri said, turning to shout at a boy to fetch the sweepings. He moved to the far end of the stall, arguing prices with a woman in a red kerchief. Matteo stayed where he was, eyes sliding over the crowd. a banker's clerk with ink on his cuffs, a pair of butchers, sleeves rolled, laughing too loudly, a priest with a face as tired as a smudged page. Shadows shortened, almost imperceptibly. The awning's stripe shifted closer to the front board of the stall. The bells of a convent down the street counted the quarter hour. The sound braided itself through the market noise and was gone. A man stepped into the shadow. He was very ordinary. That was the first thing Matteo noticed. Mid-height, mid-build, mid-face, a cloak the colour of dust, every detail forgettable. His hand rested on the edge of the stall, fingers pale from cold. The other hand stayed under the cloak. The shadow's stripe reached the front board. Matteo moved. He knocked his parcel of herbs off the table, rosemary and hyssop scattering like green rain, and lunged across the falling stems. His shoulder hit the ordinary man just as the cloak hand came out with a knife. The blade flashed where Neri's ribs would have been. The man grunted, stumbled, and recovered with frightening speed. The knife kissed Matteo's sleeve, slicing cloth and skin together. Pain bloomed hot and local. He didn't stop. He kicked the man's knee and grabbed for the knife hand, learned in Santa Croce to choose the weapon, not the man. The knife clattered to the cobbles. The man went for Matteo's eyes with his thumbs, a quick, ugly little move. Matteo jerked back. The thumbs grazed his brow instead. Neri, cursing like a good Christian should not, swung a gutting board and caught the attacker across the temple. It would have laid Matteo out. The man swayed, blinked, and bolted. Matteo ran. They shouldered past a woman with a basket of pears. A pear burst underfoot and skidded him sideways. The man was fast, turning into a cut-through where laundry hung low like flags of surrender. Matteo reached for a sleeve and got a fist in the mouth for his trouble, a bright shock of blood and salt. "Stop!" someone shouted, which never stopped anyone. The man vanished into a knot of bodies near the far corner and was gone. When Matteo burst through, he found only the tail of a brown cloak and then the flat certainty of an empty alley. He stood, chest heaving, and tasted iron. The bells of San Lorenzo sounded once, twice, practice pulls, not the hour. The irony made his vision tilt for a heartbeat. "Matteo," he turned. Carlo was there, hair damp, eyes narrowed, moving with the coiled stillness that preceded bad news. He took in the cut sleeve, the blood at Matteo's lip, the scattered herbs behind him at the stall. "What did you find?" Carlo asked. Matteo held out the strip of parchment. This was tied to the clapper in San Lorenzo. It named the hour and the place. I don't think it was meant for Vanni. Carlo scanned the symbols, then the numbers, then the single line of handwriting. His face didn't change, but the air around him seemed to cool. "Someone wants us to watch the bells," he said. "Or wants us to watch the wrong bell," Matteo replied. Carlo's mouth twitched once. Approval, faint and fast. "Good, you're thinking from both ends." They walked together to the shade of a doorway where the street narrowed and voices flattened. Carlo held the strip to the light. "These numbers look like hours," he said, "but the repetition, 11 twice, says towers. 6 towers, or a sequence. 6th tower, 11th stroke." "Or a melody," Matteo said, unexpected words in his mouth. "A pattern of sound. Florence hears time, the author writes in it." Carlo glanced at him sidelong. "You've been listening to too many lutes." Matteo shrugged, then winced as the cut on his arm pulled. The message made good on its promise. Neri's ribs nearly met a knife, and the man who tried? No face, nothing to remember. "That is a face," Carlo said, "the kind a man puts on when he wants to pass through a crowd like fog." He tucked the parchment away. "We go to Giuliano, and we keep this quiet until we know which ears we can trust." They cut through the alleys toward the Medici townhouse. The city's morning had thickened. Donkey bray, hawker cry, the slap of wet laundry against stone. Above it all, the bells marked the small divisions of day, quarters and halves, the notes that make a life seem orderly. Inside Giuliano's study, the air held a different rhythm. The whisper of pages, the soft thud of a signet. Giuliano looked up as they entered, eyes pausing on Matteo's torn sleeve. "Another morning, another wound," he said dryly. "Do I owe you for this one as well?" Matteo smiled despite himself. "You can pay me in clean bandages." Carlo laid the strip on the table. Giuliano read it once, twice. He traced the numbers as Matteo had done, then leaned back. "Tell me everything," he said. They did. The clapper, the code, the shadow on the awning, the knife, the no face. Giuliano's jaw worked as if chewing a thought. "We cannot have the bells used to orchestrate fear," he said. "If the city believes the sound of time itself rings death." "Panic," Carlo finished, "and a preacher ready to baptize it." Matteo felt the words settle like a weight. There will be more messages. "There always are," Carlo said. Giuliano nodded once, decision made. "You two will find them, quietly. We will post no extra guards on towers. That will only tell our enemy we're watching. But I will need a pattern, something I can place before the Signoria if this turns." Matteo looked at the numbers again. 6, 11, 4, 11, 2. They weren't just notes, they were steps. If he could hear them properly, if he could teach his eye to listen, he took a breath, feeling the shape of the work rise around him like a staircase in dim light. "When is the next toll?" he asked. Carlo and Giuliano spoke together, a chorus of trouble. "Soon." The next toll was hours away, but in Carlo's mind it was already rushing toward them like a drumbeat. They left Giuliano's study, with the strip of parchment tucked inside Carlo's coat, and Matteo keeping pace beside him. The Medici townhouse opened onto Via Larga, its wide flagstones slick from last night's rain. Carriages rattled past, merchants called from stalls, and overhead, the pale outline of the Duomo's dome cut against the morning sky. Matteo was silent until they reached the shadow of San Marco. "The numbers," he said. "You said they might be towers?" "They might be many things," Carlo replied, "but I have my own suspicion." He angled them toward the Mercato Vecchio, weaving between carts and baskets. "Florence has over a dozen significant bells. Some ring the hours. Others are rung for danger, victory, or death. And there's a way to read them like words if you know the city's code." Matteo raised an eyebrow. "You think this is a code that only certain people know?" Carlo gave a short, humourless laugh. "There are always certain people. Merchants who pass word about trade changes, guards who signal shifts in watch, priests who toll for a patron's death before the family even speaks it aloud. The bells talk more than the city realizes." They passed under the shadow of the Or San Michele, its niche statues catching the early sun. The square here was busy with tradesmen unloading crates of linen. The clang of metal on stone made Matteo flinch, an echo too close to the sound of a blade on armour. "And now someone's turned them into a clock for murder," Matteo said quietly. Carlo didn't answer. His eyes were scanning the edges of the square, not for the obvious, a man with a weapon, but for stillness. For the one who didn't belong in the rhythm of the morning. They turned into a narrow lane that smelled of damp wood and garlic. A thin stairway climbed the outside of a building to the bells of Sant'Ambrogio. Halfway up, a young boy was looping rope through a bundle. Carlo stopped at the foot of the stairs. "The note at San Lorenzo. Who has the keys to the bell chamber?" The boy looked down, startled. "Keys? Only Brother Aldo." "And does Brother Aldo climb the stairs himself?" The boy hesitated, shifting on his feet. "Sometimes, but he's been ill this week." Matteo shot Carlo a look. So someone else might have gone up for him. Carlo's voice was flat, and no one would question it. They left the lane, the thought sitting between them like a third companion. Whoever was planting these messages had access, not just to one tower, but to several. By the time they reached the Loggia dei Lanzi, the sun had climbed higher. The air was warmer, bustling with soldiers in the Medici livery, apprentices darting on errands, and merchants boasting about silks fresh from Lucca. Carlo stopped in the shade of the Loggia's arches. "Look at the numbers again," he said, drawing the parchment halfway from his coat. 6, 11, 4, 11, 2. If these are towers, each number matches an old registry kept by the city guard when Florence still worried about sieges. Tower 6 is San Lorenzo. Tower 11. He paused, tapping the paper. Tower 11 is the Palazzo Vecchio. Matteo felt the first knot tighten in his stomach. The Signoria's bell. Carlo nodded. And the 4th tower is Santa Croce. The 2nd is the Badia. Matteo's mind leapt ahead. So if the pattern holds, San Lorenzo, Palazzo Vecchio, Santa Croce, Palazzo Vecchio again, and then the Badia, then the next bell is... The Palazzo Vecchio, Carlo said. They both turned as if the great tower could hear its name. Even from here, its crenellated crown loomed like a sentinel over the city, the bell high above it, ready to speak. What does the note for the 2nd tower say? Matteo asked. Carlo read the cramped Tuscan aloud. When the noon light spills on the serpent among doves, the bell will judge the guilty. Matteo frowned. The serpent among doves? Piazza della Signoria, Carlo said slowly. The Medici crest above the palazzo doors, doves for peace, the serpent for vigilance. Giuliano is giving a speech there tomorrow. The knot in Matteo's stomach pulled tighter. Then the second act will be public. Carlo's mouth was a hard line. Public means panic, which means our enemy wants more than blood. They want spectacle. They stood for a long moment in the shadow of the arches, the sound of the city wrapping around them. Then Carlo tucked the parchment away and began moving again. "Where are we going?" Matteo asked. "To speak with someone who understands the language of bells better than anyone still living," Carlo said, "and to see if he hears the same threat I do." The bell chamber of the Palazzo Vecchio was not yet their destination. Carlo's plan, as always, was to get ahead of the blade before it reached its target. The piazza was already busy despite the hour. Merchants with carts of figs and almonds angled for a prime spot near the shade. Soldiers in half-armour lingered on corners, their eyes sweeping the crowd. The statue of Judith stood frozen mid-strike, the light on her bronze sword almost too bright to look at. Carlo guided Matteo through the press, speaking low. "If the pattern is right, they'll strike here when the noon sun hits the crest. That means we have hours. But if our enemy knows we're watching, they may move early, or they may stage something to keep us looking the wrong way." Matteo scanned the square. A pair of friars moved together with unusual purpose. A peddler's pack looked too heavy for the trinkets he claimed to sell. "So we watch everything?" Carlo's mouth curved faintly. "We watch what doesn't fit." The next hour was a slow grind of glances, shadows, and small interruptions. They circled the piazza twice, taking turns at vantage points, under the loggia arches, near the bronze of Perseus, and once from the second-floor window of a friendly scribe. The sun climbed steadily, burning away the thin morning haze. Then the brawl started. It began at the north end of the piazza, two apprentices shouting over a spilled basket of onions. In heartbeats it had drawn half a dozen men, voices cracking into shouts, fists swinging. The crowd surged toward it like iron to a magnet. Carlo's gaze snapped to the commotion. "Too loud, too fast," he muttered. Matteo felt it at the same time, a wrongness, as if the noise was tuned to drown out something sharper. But then he saw the movement near the palazzo doors, a man stepping out of the shadow of the column, one hand inside his cloak. Matteo moved without thinking. He shouldered through the swell of bodies, catching the man just as the glint of steel flashed from beneath the cloak. The knife was aimed low, not at Giuliano, who wasn't present yet, but at a merchant in a fine green coat standing beneath the crest. The impact drove them both against the stone. The man grunted, twisting, and the blade scraped across Matteo's ribs instead of the merchant's back. Pain flared hot and immediate, but Matteo held on, dragging the man sideways into the wall. The fight was ugly, close and fast, nothing like the staged duels sung about in taverns. The man slammed an elbow into Matteo's temple. Stars burst across his vision. Matteo answered with a knee to the thigh and felt the other man's balance falter. Carlo was there a second later, catching the attacker's wrist and twisting hard until the knife clattered on the cobbles. He drove the man to his knees with the same motion, one hand clamped on the back of his neck. The crowd was turning now, the brawl at the other end of the piazza collapsing into confusion as people realized there was another fight entirely. Carlo looked to Matteo. "You're bleeding again." "Better me than him," Matteo said, nodding to the merchant, who was still blinking in shock at the knife on the ground. Carlo hauled the attacker to his feet. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing, eyes flat, jaw tight. Matteo glanced at the line of sunlight creeping up the palazzo's wall. Noon was still some time away. This had not been the real strike, which meant their enemy was already 2 moves ahead. The quay was not a place one visited without reason. It clung to the edge of the Arno like a barnacle, a rotting tavern crouched between a cooper's shop and the black mouth of an alley no one named. Its shutters hung crooked. The smell of spilled wine and river mud reached them before they even stepped inside. Carlo pushed the door open with his boot, the hinge groaning like something in pain. Inside, the air was close, heavy with pipe smoke and the stale breath of drinkers who hadn't seen the sun in days. Matteo followed him in, scanning faces. Sailors, rivermen, a few men who might have been soldiers once, but now carried themselves like hired fists. At the far wall, a man with a scarred cheek was scratching a crude map into the table with his knife. "We're not here for ale," Carlo said under his breath. "We're here because the bells aren't the only thing our enemy knows how to use." They threaded through the crowd, earning a few muttered curses when Carlo's shoulder brushed someone's chair. At a back table sat Naldo, one of Carlo's informants, a thin man with a permanent squint and hands that moved as if always counting coins. "You're late," Naldo said, sliding a cup across the table toward Carlo. "The tide waits for no man, and neither do I." Carlo ignored the drink. The message. Naldo's fingers dipped into his jerkin and came out with a folded scrap of parchment, already damp at the edges. "Came down river from Signa. Passed hand to hand until it reached me. You didn't get it from me, understand?" Carlo took the note and passed it to Matteo. The script was the same as before, blocky, deliberate. But the words were stranger still. Open quote, "When the black horse falls, the second bell tolls." Close quote, Matteo frowned. "What's the black horse?" Naldo's smile was thin. "In this city it could be a man, a statue, or an actual horse. Take your pick." Carlo leaned back, scanning the room. "Why bring it here?" "Because," Naldo said, lowering his voice, "the man who gave it to me didn't have hands when I saw him. Just bandaged stumps. Someone wanted him silent and quick." A gust of wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the faint, far-off sound of bells, soft, almost lost in the noise of the river. Matteo's stomach turned cold. "That's not the Palazzo bells." "No," Carlo said, standing. "That's San Lorenzo, and it's tolling at the wrong hour." They were out the door in moments, into the damp night air, boots hitting the warped boards of the quay. Somewhere behind them, the river whispered against the pilings, patient as the grave. The tolling of San Lorenzo's bell was wrong in a way Matteo couldn't explain. Not just the hour, though that was enough to make every hair along his arms rise, but the weight of it, the deep, drawn-out note that seemed to press against the chest. Carlo didn't slow his pace, weaving through the riverfront crowd, scattering dockhands and hawkers who swore after them. "If the bells are off," he said, "then someone's telling us the game's moved up." They cut through a narrow street where laundry hung like ghostly banners above their heads, and the sound of the bell grew clearer. By the time they reached the Mercato Vecchio, Matteo could hear a second sound layered beneath it. Panic. A cluster of people were gathered ahead, faces turned upward toward the great bronze statue in the square, a mounted condottiere cast in darker metal than the others. The Black Horse. Matteo's pulse quickened. Even from a distance, he could see something was wrong. The statue was tilting forward, the hind hooves straining against their pedestal. Masons clung to the base, shouting orders, while ropes taut as bowstrings were lashed around the horse's flank. "It's coming down," Carlo muttered. As if in answer, one of the ropes snapped with a gunshot crack. The statue lurched. The crowd screamed. Matteo instinctively grabbed a child who had stumbled into the open space and pulled her back just as the black horse tore free. It hit the paving stones with a shattering boom, the rider's bronze arm snapping clean off and skittering across the square. The bell of San Lorenzo tolled again, once, twice, before falling silent. Someone in the crowd shouted, "It's an omen." Another cried, "Savonarola warned us." But Matteo wasn't looking at the statue anymore. He was looking at the gap in the crowd where a man had just slipped away, moving fast, keeping his head down. Carlo saw him too. "Follow!" They tore after him through the press of bodies, dodging carts and leaping over crates. The man darted into an alley barely wide enough for a cat, and Matteo followed the echo of his boots until they spilled out into a side street. It was empty. The man had vanished. Carlo cursed under his breath. He knew the moment the statue fell. That's no bystander. That's the one we're chasing. Matteo's eyes went to the gutter where scraps of paper floated in a puddle. One of them bore the same blocky script, open quote, "The third bell wakes the city." Close quote. Carlo looked up at him. "Then we'd better find out which bell they mean before it rings." By the time they reached the Piazza della Signoria, the tension in the air was taut as wire. Merchants stood in tight knots, muttering over the fallen statue and the bell that had no reason to ring. Carlo moved with the restless energy of a hunting dog, scanning the rooftops, the shadowed arcades, the faces of men too still in the crowd. Matteo kept pace, but his mind was locked on the scrap of paper they'd found. Open quote, "The third bell wakes the city." Close quote. Which tower? Matteo asked, matching Carlo's stride. Florence has dozens. Not dozens, Carlo said, only 3 with the reach to be heard in every district: San Lorenzo, Santa Maria del Fiore, and Palazzo Vecchio. He stopped suddenly, eyes narrowing at the looming bulk of the Palazzo's Arnolfo tower, and only one that faces the government's seat. Matteo felt the prickle of realization. You think it's political? I think it's war on the nerves of the city, Carlo replied. Strike once with fear, strike twice with chaos, and by the third, he trailed off. The people are ready to believe anything. They crossed the piazza toward the Palazzo Vecchio. Guards in crimson cloaks stood rigid at the gate, but Carlo moved as though they weren't there. He slipped them a Medici seal from inside his coat, low enough for no one else to see. The guard stepped aside without a word. Inside, the stone corridors swallowed sound. It was cooler here, the air thick with the smell of parchment and candle smoke. A clerk hurried past, clutching scrolls to his chest, and nearly collided with Matteo. Carlo didn't slow. He led them to the stairwell that coiled up into the Arnolfo tower. Halfway up, a noise stopped them both. The faint metallic scrape of iron on stone. Carlo motioned for silence. He crept ahead, hand on the dagger at his belt. Matteo followed, every muscle tight. They reached a small landing just beneath the belfry. A man was there, half in shadow, crouched over a wooden chest. He was winding something. No, priming it. Matteo's breath caught. It was a fuse, snaking into the base of the tower's great bell. The man looked up, and for an instant Matteo saw recognition flash in his eyes. The same man from the statue square. He bolted. Carlo lunged, catching the man's cloak, but the fabric tore in his hands. The saboteur scrambled up the last few steps, Matteo on his heels. They burst into the belfry just as the fuse's spark reached the first loop of pitch. Matteo stamped on it, the ember dying under his boot, while Carlo slammed the man into the stone wall. The man thrashed like a cornered animal, spitting curses, until Carlo drove a knee into his ribs and held him still. "Who sent you?" Carlo growled. The man only smiled through split lips. "The bells are not yours to silence." And then, from somewhere deep in the city, another bell began to toll. The sound rolled through the air like a shiver through bone, not from the Arnolfo tower, but far to the south, beyond the Arno. Carlo swore under his breath. "San Nicolò," he said, releasing the man and dragging him upright. "That's across the quay, too far to stop whatever's been set in motion." Matteo's heart kicked hard. The bell's voice was different from the others, a deeper, older sound, with a long, mournful echo that seemed to cling to the streets. Around them, clerks and guards looked up from their work, instinctively counting the chimes. 4. The prisoner grinned through a trickle of blood. "Each bell wakes another. You'll never keep pace." Carlo slammed him against the wall again. "Who is ringing them?" "The city itself," the man whispered. "She is calling for blood." Matteo felt the skin crawl along the back of his neck. "This isn't just about fear, is it? It's about where the people run when they hear it." Carlo's gaze sharpened. The bells are herding them. They had no time to question further. A runner burst into the stairwell, breathless, eyes wide. "Sir, Giuliano! He's still at the government hall, but the crowd is swelling outside. Some are armed. The bell, it's pulling them in." Carlo's grip on Matteo's shoulder was iron. "We go now." They tore back through the corridors, past startled clerks and guards, into the piazza where the noise was already building. Shouts, the tramp of feet on stone. As they pushed into the throng, Matteo could feel the strange rhythm of the bells working on the people, each chime like a pulse through the air, steady, relentless, almost hypnotic. And somewhere behind it all, the unseen hand that was winding Florence tighter with every strike. By the time Carlo and Matteo fought their way to the heart of the Piazza della Signoria, the noise was a living thing. The 4th bell's toll still clung to the air, and its echo seemed to tremble in the flagstones under their boots. The square seethed, merchants abandoning their stalls, apprentices climbing onto ledges to shout what they'd heard about why the bells were ringing, each tale darker than the last. Some claimed Savonarola's enemies were gathering to burn the convents. Others swore the Medici had ordered executions. The truth didn't matter. The air was already poisonous. Near the steps of the Palazzo Vecchio, Giuliano stood under the Medici banner, flanked by 2 guards, his voice raised in calm reassurance. But his words were being swallowed by the mob's swell. Then a cobblestone flew, arcing out of the crowd, smashing against a column behind him. A roar went up, and suddenly the space between the steps and the people felt thinner than breath. Carlo yanked Matteo close. "Find the bell runners. Someone is signalling for this to turn." Matteo scanned the edges of the piazza and saw them. 2 figures, half hidden near the wool merchant's arcade, raising their arms in rhythm to the crowd's chant, stirring it with every movement. "They're there!" Matteo shouted. Carlo shoved him toward the arcade. "Go, I'll get Giuliano inside." Matteo pushed through the press of bodies, shoving past elbows and shoulders, ducking as another stone whistled through the air. The figures saw him coming and bolted into the narrow passage behind the arcade. He followed, the noise of the piazza fading into the dim, tense silence of the alley, just in time to hear the faint, distant toll of a 5th bell. The 5th bell's toll shuddered through the stones beneath Matteo's boots, a deep sound that seemed to follow him into the alley like a predator's breath. The 2 figures were quick, darting between rain-slick walls, slipping through gaps that barely fit a man's shoulders. Matteo gave chase, lungs burning, every footfall a drumbeat against the cobbles. They led him past shuttered workshops and along the back of the silk dyer's quarter, where the air was thick with the ghost of old dyes. At one corner, one of the runners glanced back, a narrow, pale face framed by the hood of a friar's robe. But the eyes were all wrong, cold, sharp, assessing. Matteo lunged when they turned sharply into a lane barely wide enough for 2 men. His fingers brushed the trailing edge of a cloak, but the second runner slammed a barrel into his path, forcing him to vault it. The 6th toll came, not from San Nicolò this time, but from somewhere closer, maybe San Lorenzo. The sound made the air in the alley seem to tighten. The runners split at a small courtyard, one diving into a stairwell, the other vanishing under a wooden archway. Matteo chose the stairwell, boots hammering upward into the dim interior of what smelled like a tannery. The building was silent except for the dull hum of the city beyond, until a voice called from above, "Too slow, boy." He looked up. One of the runners stood on the landing, arm drawn back, hurling something small and dark. Matteo barely had time to duck before the object shattered on the steps beside him, spraying him with an acrid liquid that burned his eyes. Blinking tears away, he stumbled up, the 6th toll still echoing in his skull. Matteo surged up the last steps, half blind from the stinging liquid, but driven now by stubborn fury. The runner ahead faltered, a boot slipping on the wet wood of the landing. Matteo didn't think. He threw himself forward, tackling the man hard enough to rattle the railing. They crashed to the floor, grappling in the gloom. The runner's elbow slammed into Matteo's ribs, but Matteo hung on, dragging the hood back. A young man, not much older than Matteo, stared up at him, breathing hard, his jaw tight with defiance. The 7th bell tolled, deep and resonant, and something about its timing made the runner flinch. "Who's calling the bells?" Matteo demanded. "Tell me!" The man spat blood, but Carlo's voice cut through the doorway below. "Matteo! Move him!" Within moments, Carlo was there, hauling the prisoner upright and binding his wrists with a strip of cord torn from his own cloak. "Found the other?" Matteo asked. "He's gone," Carlo said grimly. "But this one will talk." He reached into the runner's robe and pulled out a small brass bell clapper, still warm from use. The boy stared at it, then at Matteo. "You don't know what you've stopped." Carlo met Matteo's eyes. "No, but we're going to find out." Outside, the 7th toll faded into the damp Florentine air. For now, Giuliano was safe, and the bells were silent. But not for long. The cell beneath the Palazzo Medici smelled of damp stone and old fear. A single candle burned on the wall bracket, its light falling across the bound figure slumped on the bench. Matteo stood just inside the doorway, letting the silence stretch. The runner's head was bowed, but his shoulders were tense, too tense for a man who had accepted his fate. Carlo stepped forward first, pulling the brass clapper from his cloak pocket and letting it dangle between 2 fingers. The faint ring it gave when it knocked against his knuckle seemed to tighten the air in the cell. "You carried this for a reason," Carlo said. and you dropped it at the wrong time." The prisoner's lip curled. "You think you've stopped anything? The bells ring with or without me." Matteo leaned against the wall, watching him. "Then tell us who else carries one." The man gave a dry laugh. "You wouldn't live long enough to write the list." Carlo's patience was shorter. He yanked the hood fully back, revealing a shock of cropped fair hair and a livid scar across the man's cheekbone. "Your choice is simple. Tell us who's sounding the bells, or we hand you to the city watch, and I can promise they will be less polite." The man's eyes flicked to Matteo, and something about the look made Matteo step closer. "Every toll has been a warning," the prisoner said softly. "But not for you. For him." "Who?" Matteo asked. The prisoner's mouth twisted into a smile. "Giuliano de Medici. The bells are counting down to the day he falls." Carlo's jaw tightened. "Then we're going to find the bell tower before it strikes for the last time." The candle guttered in a sudden draught, and the shadows in the cell seemed to lean closer. The prisoner's words lingered long after they left the cell, a countdown to Giuliano's death. By the time Matteo and Carlo stepped back into the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici, the sky over Florence had deepened to that heavy indigo that comes before midnight. The air carried the damp bite of the Arno, and every distant clang of metal. A blacksmith at work, a church bell being tested, felt sharper, more deliberate. Carlo didn't slow his stride. "We start with the map." In the chart room, the walls were lined with detailed sketches of Florence, some old, some new. Matteo helped Carlo spread the most recent across the main table. Dozens of towers dotted the city grid, each marked with its patron church or guild. Matteo tapped a finger on the Duomo. "Most bells are struck for liturgy, fire, or alarm. This one's different. It rings outside the schedule, deliberately irregular." Carlo's eyes narrowed. Irregular enough to avoid suspicion from the guards, but predictable to those who know the code. Matteo reached for a scrap of parchment where he had scrawled the last 3 unusual tolls. Santa Trinita, San Miniato al Monte. And tonight, somewhere north but too faint to be the Duomo. Carlo pointed to a narrow cluster of marks on the map. Up here, near the city walls, abandoned monasteries, half of them closed since Savonarola's purges. If someone wanted a hidden bell, that's where they'd keep it. They set out at once, winding through streets where the lamps burned low and the sound of their boots seemed far too loud. In the artisan district, a drunk called out to them from a doorway. Carlo kept walking without a glance, but Matteo couldn't shake the thought that every shadow they passed might be watching them back. They reached the old quarter by the walls. Here, whole streets lay silent except for the scrape of their own steps. High above, a sliver of moon caught on the jagged profile of a ruined bell tower. Carlo tilted his head. "Hear that?" Matteo strained his ears. Faint, like a breath against the night, came the sound of metal on metal, not a bell toll, but the slow turning of a great wheel. Carlo's voice was a whisper. "They're winding it." They moved toward the sound, keeping to the walls. But as they rounded the corner into the cloister square, Matteo froze. A hooded figure stood at the base of the tower, a torch guttering in the wind, his hand resting on the rope. And when the man turned at the sound of their approach, Matteo realized he'd seen that scar before. The prisoner from the cell, free. The torch hit the flagstones as the scarred man bolted for the cloister arch. "After him!" Carlo was already moving, hand on the hilt of his knife. Matteo gave chase, his boots hammering against stone, breath pluming white in the cold air. The cloister's shadows stuttered with every flicker of the abandoned torch, making the fleeing figure seem to vanish and reappear like a phantom. They burst out into the open square, the night wind catching at their cloaks. Above them the bell wheel groaned, the clapper swinging just enough to sound a single low note. It rolled through the streets like a pulse. Matteo's heart jumped. "That's the second toll." The scarred man veered into a side alley so narrow Carlo's shoulders scraped plaster. They followed, the street tilting downward toward the wall quarter. A clothesline snapped loose under Matteo's arm, tangling his stride. He tore it free, almost tripping. The alley spat them out into a carpenter's yard, littered with sawdust and the skeletal frames of half-built carts. The man vaulted one, sending a wheel rolling straight into Carlo's path. He sidestepped, knife still drawn. "Cut him off at the key!" Carlo barked. Matteo didn't hesitate. He broke right, vaulting a stack of timber and plunging into a twisting lane that smelled of pitch and rope. He knew this path. It led straight to the riverfront gate. If the man made it there, the maze of alleys and moored barges would swallow him whole. Boots pounded behind him. Carlo had doubled back. Ahead, the scarred man appeared again between the dark shapes of barrels, his breath ragged. Matteo lunged, grabbing for the man's cloak. For a heartbeat, his fingers caught rough wool. Then the man spun, slamming Matteo into a wall so hard stars burst in his vision. "Stay out of it, boy," the man snarled, "or you'll be ringing the bells with your own bones." Before Carlo could close in, he shoved Matteo aside and vanished into the river fog. They gave chase to the quay's edge, but the man was gone. Only the sound of a single, mocking bell drifted over the rooftops from somewhere deeper in the city. Carlo sheathed his knife with a snap. "That's 2 tolls. We have until the 3rd to stop him." Matteo caught his breath, still tasting dust and copper. "If we can find the bell, we can stop the killing." Carlo looked back toward the looming silhouette of the old tower. "Then we'd better find it before he rings again." By the time they made it back across the square, the rain had started. Not heavy, but enough to slick the cobbles and turn the air into a wet, cold shroud. Carlo led the way, his stride purposeful. If he's using the bells to signal, he can't be everywhere at once. That means someone else is doing the ringing. Matteo nodded, still rubbing his shoulder from where he'd been slammed into the wall. "Then we find the ringer." Their path took them to the Torre della Piazza, one of the oldest towers in Florence, its bricks the colour of dried blood under the moonlight. No guards, no lights in the slit windows. It was the kind of place no one bothered with anymore. Too old for defence, too small for storage. But it had a bell. They stepped inside, the wooden door groaning like a warning. The air smelled of damp rope and bird droppings. Matteo's torchlight danced across a spiral of stone steps that seemed to vanish into darkness. They climbed. The steps were narrow, worn concave from centuries of feet. Every sound, boots on stone, the torch's hiss, echoed upward like a whisper into a well. Halfway up, Carlo stopped and held out a hand. "Listen." Matteo froze. From somewhere above came the faint creak of a wooden beam shifting, then a muffled scrape, like metal against stone. They moved again, slower now, keeping to the wall. The stairs opened into the belfry, an open timber frame holding the great bronze bell, its clapper hanging still. Ropes trailed down into a coil on the floor, the hemp damp and rough. Matteo's gaze caught something on the inside of the frame, shallow scratches etched into the wood in neat rows. He stepped closer, tracing them with his fingertips. They weren't random, they formed a sequence. "Notches," he murmured. "One for each toll." Carlo came to look. "Or each killing." Matteo's stomach turned. The marks were grouped in 3s, each group under a faint line carved deeper into the wood. "It's a calendar," Matteo realized. "But not by dates, by bells. Each grouping matches the time between tolls. If the next is due." He counted the spaces with his finger. "It'll be before midday tomorrow." Carlo's jaw tightened. Then the killer's schedule isn't random. He's using the bells to count down for someone else. Before Matteo could reply, the stairwell below creaked, a sound far too heavy to be the wind. Carlo motioned for silence, and together they pressed back into the shadows of the belfry. The creak came again, closer now, the slow, deliberate tread of someone who knew the stairs and wasn't afraid to use the noise. Matteo's pulse climbed into his ears. Carlo drew his dagger without sound, the steel catching the faintest ember of torchlight before he killed the flame with a quick pinch of his fingers. Darkness swallowed them. Only the pale wash of moonlight through the belfry's open arches gave shape to the bell's curve above their heads. The footsteps reached the last turn in the stairwell. A figure emerged, broad-shouldered, hood low, carrying a length of chain coiled around one arm. He paused at the top step, sensing the change in the air. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice low but carrying. Neither Carlo nor Matteo moved. The intruder took another step forward, letting the chain slide free with a metallic hiss. "You don't understand," Matteo said quickly, though his voice came out sharper than he intended. "There's going to be another toll. Tomorrow. More blood." "That's the point," the man replied. He lunged. The chain snapped out, wrapping around Carlo's forearm before he could step aside. Carlo grunted, twisting against the pull, and Matteo did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the bell rope and yanked hard. The great bronze throat above them groaned, and the clapper swung, striking once with a sound that rattled their bones. The intruder flinched at the deafening clang, and Carlo used the moment to twist free, slashing the dagger across the man's side. The fight was chaotic, the man swinging the chain in brutal arcs, Carlo ducking and countering in the tight space between beams, Matteo scrambling around the frame to avoid getting trapped. A blow from the chain glanced Matteo's shoulder, sending pain flaring down his arm. He staggered, catching himself on the rope, then used it, swinging it upward to tangle around the man's arm. Carlo closed in, driving the man back toward the open arch. One more step and he'd have gone over. But instead, with a snarl, the man dropped low and dove through the opposite gap, vanishing into the night. They rushed to the opening, but all they saw was the black silhouette of rooftops and the twisting thread of an alley below. "He knows we've seen the markings," Carlo said, breathless. "That makes him more dangerous." Matteo pressed a hand to his throbbing shoulder, "and it means he'll change the plan." The morning broke with a muted light, as though Florence itself was reluctant to wake. The rain had passed, but the streets still glistened, and every sound seemed to carry too far. The clatter of a cart wheel, the bark of a dog, the distant roll of a bell tolling prime. Matteo stood in the Medici townhouse courtyard, his shoulder bound with a strip of linen Carlo had pulled tight enough to make him curse. Across the cobbles, Carlo and Giuliano were bent over the coded pages, the ink smudges now faint in daylight. "It's wrong," Carlo said, tapping the parchment. Every previous message predicted a time with the rhythm of the bells. Even the intervals made sense. Now it's broken. "That's deliberate," Matteo said. "He saw us in the tower. He knows we'll be looking for the next chime, so he's scrambling the pattern." Giuliano's gaze was steady. "Then you have one morning to rebuild it before the city panics. The next toll may not wait for sunset." Matteo studied the messages again. At first glance they were meaningless, fragments of psalms, odd numbers, references to saints' feast days, but then his eyes caught on a small shift in the scribe's hand. One letter in each message had a flourish unlike the rest. He pulled the pages together, lining the marks side by side. Slowly the outline of Florence emerged, not on paper but in his mind. A trail through the city's towers. "It's not about the bells," Matteo said. "It's about the order in which they'll ring. San Pier Maggiore, Santo Spirito, then San Marco. He's sending us on a path." "Or leading us into a trap," Carlo said. "Either way," Giuliano replied, reaching for his cloak. "We don't wait for the sound. We move now." The climb to San Pier Maggiore was steep, the lane narrowing until the horses' hooves struck sparks from the stone. The air was sharp with the smell of damp rope and wood smoke drifting from the bakers' ovens. Morning markets were opening, a blur of carts, fishmongers and cloth sellers, but Matteo felt the eyes. Not the passing glance of townsfolk, but the still, weighted stare that follows you through a crowd. Carlo noticed too. He angled his horse to block Matteo from a side street just as two men in heavy cloaks drifted into view. Their faces were in shadow, but their pace matched the Medici riders stride for stride. "Keep moving," Carlo murmured without looking back. "If they mean trouble, we'll know soon enough." The bell tower rose ahead, its pale stone streaked with age. The steps at its base were empty save for an old bell ringer warming his hands over a brazier. Matteo dismounted, scanning the carved lintels. He'd expected another page or a carved mark like before, but instead his eye caught a strip of red ribbon tied to the bell rope itself. He tugged it free. Wrapped inside was a thin sheet of vellum, scrawled with 3 words. "Third hour. Key." Carlo frowned. That could mean the dock, or... The shout came from behind them, a barked order, then the sound of boots hitting stone fast. The cloaked men had dropped the pretense. Matteo vaulted back into the saddle. Carlo wheeled his horse, steel flashing in his hand. "Key?" Matteo called as they galloped away. Carlo's grin was tight. The dock. By the time they reached the Via della Ninna, the bells of San Pier Maggiore were already tolling the half-hour. Half an hour left until the third. Half an hour until whatever the second message promised. The streets funneled them toward the river, a knot of market-goers parting reluctantly for the galloping horses. Matteo kept one hand on the saddle and the other clamped over the vellum in his pocket, as though someone might snatch it from him mid-ride. They hit the edge of the market square and the smell changed, fresh bread giving way to tar, fish, and the brackish scent of the Arno. The quay, the dockside, spread out ahead, a ragged line of moored barges, gondolas, and merchant cogs bobbing in the churning water. "Too many places to hide," Carlo muttered, scanning the cranes, warehouses and stacked crates. A heavy clang came from their left, the sound of a winch releasing. Matteo turned in time to see a crate swing down from a hoist above the quay, hurtling toward them. "Down!" Carlo barked. They ducked as the crate smashed against the cobbles, bursting into a scatter of fish and broken slats. The crowd erupted in shouts, scattering in every direction. In the confusion, Matteo caught sight of one of their cloaked pursuers slipping into a warehouse by the waterline. Carlo saw it too. "That's our rat." They dismounted, weaving through the panicked crowd. Inside, the warehouse was dim, lit only by slats of daylight between warped boards. Nets hung from beams like ghostly veils. Somewhere above, a gull screamed, and then the bell began its slow, solemn tolling. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a crossbow levelled. "Too late, Medici," he said, the accent thick with the south. The third toll of the bell shuddered through the air, vibrating in Matteo's ribs. The crossbowman didn't blink. His aim was steady, the string taut. "One step closer," he said, "and you'll be dragging him out of here in pieces." Carlo raised his hands slightly, the way a swordsman might just before feinting. "You've got your chance. Take it." His tone was cold, almost daring. The fourth toll. The man hesitated. Not much, just a flicker in the eyes, but Matteo saw it. The pause of someone who wasn't expecting their target to stand so still. The fifth toll. Matteo's fingers brushed the rough handle of a fish crate beside him. Heavy, off balance, perfect. The sixth toll. He swung it with everything he had. The crate exploded in a spray of salted herring, the smell choking the air. The crossbow twanged. The bolt searing past Carlo's cheek and burying itself in a post. The seventh toll. Carlo moved in the same heartbeat, crossing the distance in 3 strides. The blade flashed once, and the crossbow clattered to the floor. The man staggered back, clutching his wrist, then lunged for a knife hidden in his boot. The 8th toll. Matteo was already moving. He kicked the weapon away, sending it skittering across the planks into the shadows. The man backed up until his shoulders hit the wall. The 9th toll. Carlo slammed him against the boards, the point of his dagger pressing under the man's jaw. "The next words you speak decide whether you walk out of here." The 10th toll. The man's breathing was ragged, sweat cutting lines through the grime on his face. "The bells, they're not for him," he whispered. "They're for you, both of you, and you've only just begun to hear them." The man's words hung in the salt-heavy air long after the final toll faded. Carlo's blade didn't move. "Who sent you?" A thin smile cracked the man's lips. "If you have to ask, you're already too far behind." Carlo's fist landed hard against the boards beside the man's head, making him flinch. "Name." But Matteo caught the flicker of movement behind them, the smallest shadow breaking the line of quay lights. "Carlo?" They spun together. Another figure bolted from the alley, a dark blur darting between crates. Carlo pushed the crossbowman away and gave chase, Matteo close behind. The night was wet with mist, the woods slick underfoot. Twice Matteo nearly lost his footing, and twice Carlo's hand dragged him upright without slowing. The figure hit the edge of the quay and leapt for the water. By the time they reached it, only ripples marked where he'd vanished. Carlo stood, chest heaving, scanning the black water. Let him go. He's a decoy. When they turned back, the crossbowman was gone too. Only the shattered crate, the fish, and the lodged bolt in the post remained as proof of what had just happened. They returned to the Medici townhouse before dawn. Giuliano was alive and unharmed. His public address had been postponed after a matter of state security. The bells had tolled, but no public blood had been spilled. In the quiet of the courtyard, Carlo handed Matteo the bolt. Its shaft was carved with a series of tiny notches. "A code," Carlo said. "Whoever's ringing these bells has more to say." Matteo turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of the message hidden in plain sight. "We stopped the killing." For today, Carlo said. But Florence is still listening, and the bells will ring again. The dawn broke pale over the city, carrying the uneasy truth. They had won a battle, but the war in the shadows was far from over.
This was The Bells of Blood, written by Beryl Coops. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.